Well, hi, everybody. I'm Catherine Boyle from Key Ministry. Thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar on addressing trauma in children. And this is a webinar where we're going to be focusing on how ministry leaders and pastors can be thinking about sexual abuse trauma from both a prevention perspective as well as how to minister to kids who have had that kind of experience in their background. And we have a wonderful guest who has joined us today. Brianna Edwards is a licensed mental health counselor and registered play therapist. She has a busy practice in the Orlando, Florida area. And Brianna, we're just delighted that you have taken some time to be with us today. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be great. So Brianna graciously wrote a really insightful, packed full of information blog post for us about 3 or 4 weeks ago, October 21st, on the Church for Every Child blog. And it was geared more towards parents who, are thinking about, gosh, I want to make sure my kid is safe wherever my child is, especially if my child is not with me. So whether that's in the home, whether that is in church, wherever. So she just had some great tips and information for parents. But we also wanted to make sure that ministry leaders had an opportunity to really think about this because, goodness, nobody wants church to be anything but a place where people are loved and welcomed and cherished. Brianna's on today to help, talk to those ministry leaders who are joining and also will be looking at this after the fact. So, the blog post was directed to parents, but today and in the future, when people are watching this, we will probably be having children's pastors and youth pastors look at this. So, what kind of prevention strategies, just kind of, right off the bat, would you recommend for a ministry leader who's looking to make sure that no child is ever harmed in this way in church?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. First, before I even go into that, I just want to broadly define sexual abuse.
Yes.
Because it's any non-consensual touch or sexual contact, which also would include verbal comments and inappropriate photos and videos. So we're looking at a really broad definition. It's not just maybe what we've stereotyped as sexual abuse.
Right.
And so I just want you to have that broad definition in your mind. And I also want you to think this can happen between adult and child and also child on child.
Right.
And so we're looking at both of those as I talk through everything today. So I have a bunch of different prevention things, so I'm just going to fire them off.
Okay.
And so first one is asking permission before touching any child or teenager. So before you move in for a hug, before you even give a high five, any sort of touch, before you even put your hand on the back, saying, is it okay if I do this? And giving the child permission to be able to say yes or no. And then being okay with their answer. Can you compromise for an air high five, or what creative ways can you still have that connection without the physical contact if the child doesn't want it? And then, with that, I mentioned choices. It's so powerful to offer choices to the child. It helps them feel empowered. So that could be with the physical touch choices. It can also be with calm down strategies. If you're noticing that they're upset, what ways it could be who they're going to be with for the time of a service or in a classroom. The more that we can empower with choices, the better, because if there's been any sexual abuse, or even as we're looking to prevent it, kids, when they're in a place of vulnerability, don't have choices. A victim does not have choices. So the more we can empower with choices, the better. Also, helping kids and teens know who they can go to if they do feel compromised. So if they're starting to feel uncomfortable, who are a few different individuals that kids can go to and share that they're feeling uncomfortable. You don't want to just be one person, because what if that's
Right.
the person that is unfortunately doing the sexual behaviors?
Right.
So having choices of adults. And then if a child discloses to you, taking it seriously, because you never know. I was reading, there's just so much data on delayed disclosure, and a lot of disclosure about sexual abuse doesn't happen until adulthood. So this stuff is happening in your
Right.
in your communities, in the
Right.
people you come in contact with. We just don't know. And
Right.
so if the child says something to you, take it seriously, investigate, even if it is against one of your top leaders or another pastor. And that validates the child's voice.
Right.
There's just so much there. And then also, from a practical side of prevention, I think about having safety policies in place about not having kids alone with an adult, or, having cameras around, encouraging volunteers if they see something to say something. And we know that a lot of sexual abuse happens in bathrooms. So that's
Right.
an area that you really want to be vigilant in. And again, watching the child on child situation. You could send a
Right.
bunch of kids to the bathroom, they're all together in there, but what's
Right.
happening in the bathroom?
Well, and your point about, photos being an issue,
Yes.
everybody has a cell phone. Every kid has a cell
Right.
phone. So, I mean, it is frighteningly easy how, for this sort of thing to happen, even when you think you have taken every measure to be vigilant.
Right. Right. And
Yeah.
I would also say too that though of course background checks are recommended for every volunteer, and,
Right.
and should, very stringent background checks should take place, that doesn't guarantee that someone is going to be safe. And
Of
I
course not.
know I
Right.
know of individuals in the school setting, for example, that have gone through all the wonderful strict background tests that have ended up being the perpetrator. And so it's not I've background checked everyone, we're safe,
Right.
and then
Right.
just living in this like dismissive bubble. This stuff is happening
Mhm.
everywhere. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the stats bear that out. And, this is very much a situation where I believe that, we have to be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. I mean, you want to believe that nobody would be capable of doing something like this. But again, the statistics don't bear that out. So yeah, trust but verify. So
exactly.
yeah, so I am going to jump around a little bit in our discussion here today as we were, preparing for this. So let's just say that a children's pastor, learns that, there's a child who has experienced sexual abuse in their background, whether, it's a child that has grown up in that church, a child who is new to the church because they are in foster care with a church family or have been adopted. What are some strategies that you recommend for ministry leaders to be thoughtful about, approaches that are taken, for example, in children's ministry? Let's just start there, with younger kids. What are some things that children's pastors may want to maybe alter in the way that things are done within their ministry when they become aware that there's a child that has had this kind of trauma in their background?
So if you find out that there's a child with sexual abuse in your kids ministry, you're going to want, going back to some of the things that I previously said about asking permission, giving choices. Those are things we're automatically, I mean, those work with any child, but we're going to want to be more vigilant to use those tools. And then also, I would say to expect behaviors,
Okay.
because you're not going to necessarily have the child ever verbally tell you what their experience has been. They might not even have any remembrance of what's happened. You might know from the parents, but we can expect there to be a heightened stress response and more behaviors. And so I really believe being equipped for the behaviors and how to create an environment of felt safety for the child is critical.
Okay, excellent. A couple other people have joined. Just want to throw this out every so often. If you've got a question for Brianna, she is a licensed mental health counselor, a certified play therapist. Feel free to add your question in the chat and we will work your questions in as we're able to. So, so that same question or that same topic, but now focus more on teens, because as kids get older, they start going away with their friends. They're away from the family. They are, going to camp. They're going to mission projects for the day or overnight. There's an endless possibility of things that they can be doing, where the parents won't have direct oversight. So, what are some things, assuming that there may be behaviors that, children may act out? I mean, what are some things that you recommend for the ministry leaders to help them be ready and to help the kids, I guess, experience church as a safe and positive place if they're an older child?
I would say, first of all, it's all about relationship. So whether that's with a child or a teenager, or even volunteer to volunteer or leader to volunteer, it's all about creating the felt safety. And when I say felt safety, that means our experience, the experience in our body, where we're not just knowing cognitively, I'm in a safe building right now, but I'm feeling safe. My nervous system is calm. And so when we're in relationship, you think about someone who's been through any type of sexual abuse or has a trauma history, your nervous system is keyed up. How do we cultivate such a safety and relationship where there's been distrust in the past? It takes time. So we can't expect the relationship to come overnight, but how can we meet the child or teen's needs to help them feel safe? And then again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but with a teenager, offering choices and helping them to use their voice, if it is going off to something like camp, simply asking, what do you need to feel safe? If they're having trouble, let me just pick a random thing, like sleeping in the dark. Well, can we bring a night light for you? Is there some other transitional object you like to have? Who could you call if you start feeling scared at night? And what choices, how can we build up their confidence and empower them with that felt safety?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And I think the temptation is to overthink these kinds of things, that you have to have some grand program and strategy, but it's not. I mean, mental health ministry as a whole, and in this specific instance as well, is more about, there's a need here, let's meet it. And then that it's unlocks all the other possibilities, with the relationships and, deepening relationship with Christ, deepening, spiritual maturity, on and on and on. So
yes. And if I can also add with that, because it's so much about relationship, we can tend to even over spiritualize things when just you as the pastor or leader or volunteer can be the hands and feet of Jesus, and you don't have to preach at the child, because in fact, if their thinking brain is offline, they're not even going to take any of that in, but just providing that felt safety as Jesus would, sitting with people, listening, that provides a felt sense of who Jesus is, rather than a cognitive overthinking, or we can tend to just be really logical about our faith, but we make it so much more experiential when we live into this relationship.
Yeah, we had at my church, we had a youth pastor one time who he had dinner with every youth's family. And I just think that's a wonderful idea, that if you're a ministry leader, particularly if you have a child that you are just, has behaviors at church, maybe it does take, literally breaking bread with the family to help that person know that, wherever you are, it can be a place of safety for that child.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, so, in your blog post from October 21st, and I encourage anybody who's watching this, who's just tuned in, to definitely go read that. But you had a lot of really great information there, just different behaviors that, parents shouldn't ignore. But, I know, like a change in behavior can be a big red flag. But, like how might that play out in the church environment? Let's say for a youth, a teenager, what would, if a child is experiencing sexual abuse and this is a new thing in their life, what kind of behavior might a youth leader be seeing at church?
So I say that any behavior can be a protective behavior. And it's what is the teen or child doing to keep themselves safe? So you might see lying, you might see withdrawing, sitting alone, appearing depressed. I once had, when I worked in kids ministry before I even got my master's, I had a child come up to me, and during a worship song, she just started sobbing. And I didn't know what to do, but it turns out that she had been triggered by a trauma. And so like the song reminded her of her uncle's death. I had another girl come up to me and disclose her sexual abuse, and I didn't know what to do. So those are two behaviors. I mean, you can have the verbalizing, you can have the emoting, and the triggered behaviors. You might also just get kids that are shut down and what we call dissociated, where they look like they're not present and they're somewhere in their mind because they're just trying to cope. But you're going to see survival behaviors, and you're going to see most of the time walls come up because if, as we know, statistics show 91% of sexual abuse happens with close, trusted family members or individuals that the family knows, like the church. So let's say something happens in the church or somewhere else familiar. Why would a child come to church believing they can trust anyone there? They're going to be on high alert. And so that could come out as fighting, that could come out as that isolation, that can come out as running away or hiding. There's so many different behaviors you could see.
Right. Yeah, I think it's excellent that you mentioned things, even, that from a Christian perspective, we think we put lying in this box of, sin and choice, and that there cannot be a reason for that. But in fact, oftentimes there is a reason for that. And it's really important to get, to not just deal with whatever the lie is, but why did the lie happen in the first place? So, ministry leaders just definitely keep that in mind.
Yes, having a curiosity rather than a judgment, a curiosity of what is the need behind this child's behavior.
Yes, absolutely. This is, before we get going, I was talking about Adoption and Foster Care Awareness Month. It's right now, it's November. We'll have posts on our social media about that, because obviously, caring for orphans is a huge part of what the church should be about. So have you seen, or do you have specific resources that you would recommend to families who were thinking about, becoming foster parents or becoming, adopting a child that maybe, for whatever the reason? I mean, oftentimes there's trauma in the background, even if it's not something that is specifically disclosed. So like, how would you recommend that parents, prepare that they might be dealing with something like sex abuse trauma?
Well, I love the resource, and I've told you this multiple times, trust-based relational intervention. If you do a simple Google search of TBRI, a bunch of stuff will come up. There's some videos I believe we'll include in the show notes later, but TBRI was developed from Texas Christian University by doctors Karyn Purvis and David Cross. I'm a TBRI practitioner, actually, so I'm very passionate about it, but it's all about creating felt safety with the child, creating that that safe relationship, and then also about seeing the need behind the child's behaviors and meeting those needs, and then correcting through the lens of connection rather than maybe more of that punitive stance that many parents take, because that's how maybe we were raised or something like that. It just teaches new tools and gives you a trauma-informed approach to the child, because I would say not just are some kids who are adopted, not just some have trauma backgrounds. I would go out on a limb and say all have trauma history. Every single child who was adopted has a trauma history, even if they were adopted from the hospital straight, day of born. It's still a loss. You lost your mom who you were in utero with for 9 months. Everything familiar is gone. That's a trauma,
Right.
So
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. Definitely understand that. Those who are on the webinar, definitely add questions in the chat as you think of them. Beth, my colleague, has added a link to the post that Brianna shared on October 21st. So definitely go check that out if you haven't already. One thing that we say often is that behavior is communication.
Yes.
And it is so important to really understand what is being communicated, not just that, the person hates your guts or, is a destructive human being, but, there's something underneath that they are actually communicating as well.
Yes. And actually, if I can also add with the resources too.
Yes.
So with TBRI, there's a bunch of YouTube videos, but then there's also the Connected Parent and the Connected Child, which are two books. There's another really good book called The Whole Brain Child. And that's talking about using the right and left hemispheres of the brain to just have more effective parenting and understand the child's behaviors. And then one for trauma specifically is The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog by Bruce Perry. And that one is really fascinating with vignettes and stories to help you understand trauma. So.
Yeah, if you would unpack that a little bit for us, just the whole right versus left brain thing, because I mean, I read all the time. I'm always reading stuff for the ministry, but it's really fascinating to me about how, trauma, whether it's sexual abuse trauma or other, it's like it causes an emotional response. I guess that's whichever side that is. But it's like you have to be able to move it from one side to the other. Like you have to be able to put words to it so that you can be healed from it and move on. So, but I'm not an expert in this in any way. So I'd love to hear just a little bit more about that, because I think that that would be helpful for those who are listening today.
Definitely. So there's the logical left brain. So those of us that are really analytical thinkers, we're going to function really well out of our left brain. And then the right brain is more of the feeling brain, artistic, that sort of a thing. Some people lean more towards that side.
Sure.
Now, if you go through a traumatic experience, you can get stuck in one side or the other. So you can be really flooded by emotion in the right side of the brain and not have any words for it, or you can be too logical and completely disconnected from your feelings. So, in my therapy sessions, using a lot of experiential work and even EMDR, use it, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a type of trauma therapy to integrate both sides of the brain back and forth. Now that is horizontal integration, but then there's also vertical integration, and there's the prefrontal cortex, which is the last part of our brain to develop, our thinking, like our thinking brain that's able to problem solve, things like that. And then our downstairs part of the brain, which is more primitive, the lower part, that developed first with our brainstem. And that is our survival system, our stress response. And so that when there's been trauma gets overdeveloped, and we more quickly go into the stress response. And if I can just use this little hand model of the brain. So if you think about this being your brain, this is your prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain. And then this is the amygdala. And then we just look at this as our brain stem and our lower downstairs stress response brain. Right. When we get triggered, we flip our lid and we're left only with the stress response. And so when we try to use words with kids or with adults, whoever, it doesn't work because all we've got is our most primitive survival skills of fight, flight, freeze. So we have to regulate the body before this part of the brain can come back online.
Yeah, makes total sense. That's excellent. Excellent. Yeah, I don't know if you've had a chance to read, but yesterday and I think a week and a half ago, we had blog posts from a woman who experienced sexual abuse from, I think she was 8 or 9 years old when the abuse began. It was somebody that was familiar to the family, went on for a long time, very, very traumatic, but, she has done tons of, counseling and also really leaned into her relationship with Christ and has written very eloquently on the experience. But, she talks about, not having the words and, being in survival mode and those kinds of things. And before we jumped on today, we were talking a little bit about implicit memories. And this is something that's really fascinating to me. And I hope that, ministry leaders will think about this too, because like you were talking about when a baby is adopted from birth, I mean, this is a very personal issue for me. My husband was adopted from birth. But yeah, I mean, any kind of change like that, is gonna have an impact, even though you can't articulate it. So, so what are some of the things that you do as a therapist, as a play therapist, with children who have had abuse at a very young age before they're verbal? What sorts of things can be helpful for them to process through, that trauma, so that they aren't in this mode all the time, but they're more in this mode. Because I think that could be really helpful for ministry leaders who are watching too. Like, what kind of play strategies have you used that can be helpful?
Yeah. So basically everything that I do is experiential, because when we use experiential modalities, which is play therapy, like I'm not in my office right now, but if I was, you would see a ton of toys, my whole room. You wouldn't even know that it was a therapy office. It just looks like a playroom, because it is. And all of the toys are my tools. And so letting a child play and not guiding them where their play is going to go. Like sometimes I do give instruction, hey, make me a picture of a time a kid felt angry or a time you felt angry or something like that. But then sometimes I just let them play, and that is when their implicit or subconscious, memories come out, and I don't have to be able to make meaning of what they're playing out. The most important thing is that they're able to give voice to it through their play, and I'm just bearing witness to it. Right. And it's the most awe-inspiring thing. But so play or art is another modality I use a lot, because it bypasses our cognitive brain where we're over analyzing, and it gives voice to more of that felt sense in the body. And then also EMDR, as I mentioned, helps to go back to some of those earlier felt experiences.
Excellent. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of, I don't know much about brain development, in that regard, but it sounds like a lot of what happens with children, maybe is more right brain focused as they, because, I mean, I know as a parent that, that the logic and the analytics develop later in children. So it makes more sense that yeah, you have to really, work with them at the level where they understand, which is, play when they're younger. So makes total
Exactly.
sense.
Exactly.
Well, pastors, ministry leaders, I mean, you've been in this situation yourself, often have people, tell you things that are difficult, that are heartbreaking. If a ministry leader who's watching today, learns that a child is being sexually abused, what are some things that you recommend as a mental health professional for that person to do to help, to help that child right then and there, no matter what their age is?
Mm-hmm. So if a child, I guess there's two different things. If a child were to make a disclosure to you versus finding out that a child has experienced, I mean, there's two different things. If a child makes a disclosure to you, like I said earlier, validate their experience. Thank you for telling me. You must have been so scared. You were so brave to tell me. And then investigate the situation, make a report to Child Protective Services as appropriate. Everything should be documented, in your church, and then also to the hotline. And then, the child is going to be watching. If this is something that happened at your church, and I would say a lot of sexual abuse in the church flies under the radar, so you may never know, unfortunately.
Right.
But if you are lucky enough or blessed enough for a child to make a disclosure about what's happening, they're going to be watching you to see how you handle the situation. And that it puts a lot of weight on your shoulders. But I really have seen how a church responds or how parents respond influences how kids perceive the church all the way into adulthood. Where they decide, I can't trust the church. And unfortunately, that one person tainted their view of the whole church, and they withdraw from the church, decide as they get older, anything with the church is a trigger to them. They don't want to be part of it.
Right.
So, and it influences their beliefs about God, faith, relationship, all of those things. So I really believe kids are watching. Now, if you just find out about this happening with a family in your church where a child in your ministry or a teen in your ministry is going through this, I really believe that we can maybe feel a little bit of discomfort of what do I do? Like, I'm not going to do anything at all. This is kind of an awkward topic. But I really encourage you to lean in and help the child feel seen. What do you need to feel safe? You don't have to tell them that, but really be intentional to build that safe environment for them.
Right.
And going back to all the other things I said, it's all about relationship and making church a truly safe place. And that takes intentionality.
Right.
I don't know if I really answered your question or not.
You did. And, I am not confident that ministry leaders everywhere are mandated reporters. Do you know if that is the case? I know you're in Florida. I'm in Virginia. I don't know. But there's, to your point, that the emphasis on relationship, I think, is gonna mitigate a lot of issues with maybe getting every single detail right. But if the child or teen knows that you are somebody that they can count on, that's going to go a long way towards, helping resolve whatever details that need to come after that. And this kind of confrontation is not pleasant. And, it's one of those issues where, seek counsel among the ministry team. If this is something that you become aware of, seek counsel with outside professionals like yourself to make sure that, safety is established, that, local laws are followed. And, ultimately the goal should be about, protecting the vulnerable people that are part of your flock in your community. So, for parents and probably for ministry leaders too, I mean, if I was a parent and I learned something like this, happened to my child, I mean, my go-to response is just naturally to feel guilty about everything. So anyway, but I can only imagine, if I was a ministry leader and learned that something had happened, kind of like right under my nose, how terrible I would feel, and just, how unfit I was for the role that God had called me to. But that does not mean that God has not called you to that role. So, what advice for ministry leaders who are watching this, who maybe are going through this or who have experienced this in the past, where something happened on their watch and they're feeling just tremendous guilt and shame over it, what would you recommend to them for themselves, but also for those going forward, where they may have a similar situation?
Mm-hmm. I would say, be gentle with yourself. Let yourself grieve and feel and process. Find someone that you feel safe to process with. I would say too, the enemy would be coming in with a lot of lies. And so really identifying what are the lies that you are now believing about the situation, and what truth does God want to give you in exchange. That's a really powerful exercise, to sit and identify the lies and then repent for believing the lie, and then ask Jesus in exchange what truth he wants to give you, and that can be really healing. So there was something else I wanted to say about that. But I would say, get the help that you need so that you can be most present with the people who are hurting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I remember what I was going to say. One of the most helpful things for me is this phrase, if I would have known then what I know now, I would have made a different choice.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
so giving yourself, like, if you would have known that X, Y, or Z was going to happen with that child and that volunteer or that leader, you would have been there right in the moment to handle it, but you didn't know.
Right.
So now that you know this, what can you do differently? And we have to process our feelings first, because at this point we're probably in our own stress response and we need to bring our brain back online. We can't problem solve until we've regulated ourselves, because we're feeling probably really flooded with that guilt and condemnation. And so regulating ourselves to then later problem solve, okay, let me look at this logically with my team. What new systems can we put in place so this doesn't happen again?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I love that you said that about, what you didn't know. I mean, like, no, at any time, none of us know what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It's only, through discovering that we do know. And like you said, I mean, it's a different path. It's a different choice that you make. So that is really important. And we have advocated for a long time that, we did an online pastors retreat last year because we knew what a stressful year last year was for ministry leaders. And, we really strongly advocate that ministry leaders, who are that front line with the mental health needs in their communities, get that mental health support that they need as well. I mean, they're all just people, just like everybody else. And these things do weigh on you, particularly, if you aren't satisfied yourself with, the actions or the words that you used in particular situations. So, well, we've got about 20 minutes to the top of the hour. Definitely, if you have any questions, feel free to send them in the chat and I can work them in to the conversation. But, we've been talking a lot about the negatives, but, God can do anything. I mean, I think, if you want a real life example of that, read the blog post that we shared yesterday on Church for Every Child. And then the one that the same woman, Emma, wrote a couple of weeks ago. I mean, God has used her in a powerful way to speak into the lives of others who have gone through similar kinds of abuse. And I mean, you mentioned how easy it is for children or teens who live through this kind of abuse to just totally walk away from their faith. And it makes sense, it makes total sense in a logical way that, if this happened to you, particularly with a person who is a ministry leader, somebody in your church, that, you might feel that way. And you mentioned Grace a few minutes ago, and at the end, we're going to have some great resources that Brianna recommends, including the resources from Grace, which is an acronym for Godly Response to Abuse in a Christian Environment. But one thing that they say that has always stuck with me is that that abuse of any kind, but in particular sexual abuse, is the robbery of worship in children. That's what Satan is aiming for, because I mean, you think about little children. I mean, they are trusting. They believe what people tell them. Little children absorb truths of God very easily, and their natural bent is to believe that God is real and that He is there and that He loves them. So of course Satan is going to attack that. But back to the blog post from Emma. How have you seen God redeem some of these just really painful things that some of your clients or families have gone through? What have you seen that's been just an encouragement to ministry leaders who maybe have a family who's going through this kind of thing right now?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the kids that I work with, I'm more in a season of faith for them because they're so little. I have not yet been able to see the fruit of God's redemption, though some of them are believers, and I am encouraged of what their long-term therapy with me, some of them, 3+ years of, weekly therapy, what in the long term, how God will be able to use that and the early intervention. And, so I often will look at them with just a positive expectation and a curiosity of where their life will go. But I think what I have seen is other colleagues of mine who are at the latter end of their journey, where they have done the work and they've had sexual abuse in their childhood. And instead of holding up, they have been able to get healing. And now, either they're counseling trauma victims or sexual abuse victims, and God's brought it full circle that way, where the very thing that caused the most pain for them is now bringing some of the most fruit, and they're able to provide such empathy and compassion, because of their own story.
Right.
And so that's really cool to see. In fact, many counselors have a trauma history, if not most, because research is me search. And as we're, learning about all these things, we're learning about ourselves. And so most counselors fit that bill. And so even if it's not sexual abuse, there is a redemption that comes in being able to sit with someone who has had pain in their past, like you had.
Yep. And there's a lot of people in ministry who can say that as well.
Yes.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, God loves to do things just to turn things on their head, that, you see this, you see X happen, you expect Y, but instead, X happens and you get A instead. So I love that about God, that He does that. And it's 2 Corinthians 1:3-7 in action, which says that, we're to comfort others with the comfort we've received. So it's very cool. Well, we've talked about a lot of really heavy things today, but I love to end on a more positive note. So, for ministry leaders, for parents, whoever is watching this, whether now or after the fact, what hope would you like to leave these people with as, they're thinking about this very heavy and difficult topic of sexual abuse of children, you know, what hope would you like to leave these individuals, these families and ministry leaders with today?
I would say that don't give up. If the beautiful thing is that kids are resilient and their brains are neuroplastic, meaning they're still growing, there can still be change. And so it can feel really hopeless, like this is a death sentence for their life, but it's not. And the quicker that you can help even parents get the resources or get connected with information to help the child, or that you can support the family for them to be in a healing process, that's so powerful. And don't be discouraged when, not if, when the process is slow. The healing process for most of us is lifelong. We're always in a process of growth. And so when you don't see quick results, it's okay. Give yourself permission for that to be okay, and to just celebrate the baby steps of a child walking into your ministry and being able to stay without mom or dad there, you know, because you've done it. You've created an environment where there's that felt safety, and it may take months to get there, you know, in some cases. That's just one example, but don't give up, just stick with it. And even when it's long and slow, remember that I said that so that you know that's what's going to happen, and that's okay.
Yep. Yeah, that's an excellent point. You know, God's timetable is so different than our timetable. And, you know, this microwave, you know, smartphone culture that we live in, it's so easy to forget that. You know, and then people just, you know, give up on God when, you know, that change, you know, that fruit is right around the corner. So, Brianna, would you mind sharing your website so people who are watching can get in touch with you? And we'll have this in the show notes, but I just want to make sure that those who are watching right now have access to that as well.
Yes, it's breezecounselingcorner.com. So that's BRIS counselingcorner.com. And she just put it in the chat box. Okay. So,
well, thank you so much for your time today. Yeah, so your mom just said, great job. But and thank you, Marie, for attending. I mean, your mom just does so much great work through Nathaniel's Hope. We just really appreciate, you know, her friendship with Key Ministry in that way. But thank you for joining, and we will have lots of great resources in the show notes. So definitely, if you have any more questions that maybe you think about after the fact, you can always reach out to me at Key Ministry. I'm Karyn with a C at keyministry.org, or definitely reach out to Brianna if you have something specific that you'd like to run by her, since she is a licensed mental health counselor and registered or certified play therapist. So on behalf of my colleagues at Key Ministry, I'm Karyn Boyle. Thanks so much for joining, and we will see you next time with another mental health webinar. Thanks so much.